You know why I like this study compared to a placebo-controlled study? Because it's a controlled study still, double blind, against an actual active material. So we're studying natto against a statin directly. And what I would have loved to have seen is a triple where we also studied a placebo to see what would happen with the placebo group. But what we know from this study that has been buried in China for almost a decade is that 6,000 units outperform statins by a mile, over 3-1 in what matters way more than a marker on your blood test result. And on top of this, natto is not a one-trick compound. The same enzyme has research behind it for lowering blood pressure in people already running a little high, for reducing blood viscosity so your blood simply moves easier through your vessels, for breaking down excess fibrin and inflammatory debris throughout the body, which is the same systemic enzyme category that I talked about with like fibrinza, if you've heard my episodes of fibrinza. Welcome to Vitality Radio, the podcast that helps you make sense of natural supplements and thrive without pharma drugs. I'm Jared St. Clair. I grew up in a health food store and spent over 40 years now figuring out what works and what doesn't, so that you can make confident, informed decisions about nutrition, supplements, and your health. Hello, welcome to Vitality Radio. I'm your host each and every week, twice a week. My name is Jared St. Clair, and today I want to tell you about a study that I guarantee you your cardiologist has never mentioned to you before, and probably your regular doc as well. And honestly, there's a decent chance they never even have heard of it, so maybe it's not on them, but maybe that statin they keep prescribing is. Researchers took a group of people who already had plaque built up in their carotid artery, put half of them on a statin, and gave the other half a systemic enzyme from fermented soybeans. Then they imaged everybody's arteries 6 months later to see whose plaque actually got smaller. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why you're only hearing about it from me and not on the nightly news or from your doctor, and then I'm going to explain what I think it makes sense to do about this information. And I want to give credit where it's due. This whole episode started because a guy named Sayer Ji over at his Substack dug this trial up, translated the significance of it, and put it in front of people like me who'd have otherwise probably never seen it. So hats off to him for doing the digging that most outlets won't. And another hat off to my lovely wife, Jen, who actually found this and showed it to me. But I think it's really important. As soon as she showed me the headline, I was super intrigued. So what's the question that nobody asked? Well, a quick background before we get into the good part of this study. Nattokinase, you may have heard about it, I've talked about it on this show for sure, is a systemic enzyme, not a digestive one, pulled out of natto, which is fermented soybeans, a staple in Japan and something that frankly most of us don't eat in the Western world. In the functional and naturopathic world, this has been on our radar for a long time as a circulatory support enzyme, a natural, even anti-inflammatory. It works on fibrin, the structural mesh that holds a blood clot together and oftentimes floats around in the bloodstream and creates issues. There was a large study in 2022, over 1,000 people, that came out showing nattokinase could actually shrink arterial plaque, but only at a high enough dose. Below a certain threshold, nothing actually happened in that study. Above it, though, plaque regressed. Now, hang on to that detail because we're going to circle back to it later, and it's the key to this entire episode. The study got some buzz in natural health circles. I remember reading about it. And the obvious next question was, okay, that's neat, but how does this actually compare to the drug your doctor would put you on for the exact same problem? Well, it turns out that somebody already ran that exact experiment 5 years earlier in 2017, it just never made it into the conversation here. The trial that you've never heard of, that I've never heard of, that's been done almost 10 years ago, was done in 2017 at Sun Yat-sen University, one of China's top medical research institutions. They ran a randomized trial where they took all the people who already had carotid plaque and high cholesterol. Half got a standard dose of simvastatin, a typical statin drug, and half got nattokinase. Then they used ultrasound to track the actual plaque over about 6 months. And here's the result. Nattokinase, the natural enzyme group, plaque shrank by 36.6%. That is dramatic. The statin group, plaque did shrink, but only by about 11.5%. That means that better than a 3-to-1 advantage for the enzyme, the natural approach. Now, let me explain why that specific number, plaque size, is the one you should actually care about more than almost anything else in cardiology. When you get a cholesterol panel, what you're getting is a snapshot of what's floating around in your bloodstream at the moment. LDL, HDL, triglycerides, those are useful pieces of information, but they're indirect. They're a proxy. They're an educated guess about what might be happening inside your artery walls based on population statistics. And I would dare say not a very well-educated guess because so much of this has been debunked at this point. But plaque is not a proxy. Plaque is the actual disease. It's not a marker that might indicate disease. It's the disease itself. It's the physical buildup of cholesterol, calcium, fibrous tissue, and clotting material that accumulates inside the wall of your artery over years. And here's the part that actually matters for your life. A heart attack or a stroke doesn't happen because your LDL number was too high on a lab report. It happens because a piece of that plaque either grows large enough to choke off blood flow on its own, or more commonly, it ruptures and your body's clotting system rushes in to patch the tear, and that clot is what actually blocks the vessel. No plaque, no rupture, less plaque, less material available to break loose and block anything in the first place. So when a trial measures plaque directly with ultrasound imaging, rather than inferring risk from a cholesterol number, it's measuring the actual anatomy of the disease instead of a marker that's supposed to represent it. That's a meaningful difference, far more direct kind of evidence. So why would an enzyme that dissolves clots do anything to plaque in the first place? Well, here's the piece that connects these two things together, and oftentimes people are surprised by how this works. Plaque isn't just cholesterol or calcium, or cholesterol and calcium sitting in the artery wall. In fact, I think a lot of people don't even necessarily know what plaque is. They assume it's cholesterol because cholesterol has been demonized so much over the years. But fibrin, that same clotting protein that we've been talking about that Natto specifically focuses on, fibrin is actually what gets built directly into the structure of the plaque itself. As plaque grows and develops over the years, it's constantly having tiny amounts of clotting material worked into it. And research on plaque biology has confirmed that fibrin buildup inside the plaque is tied to how unstable and advanced that plaque becomes. In other words, a plaque isn't just a pile of cholesterol sitting there. It's got a scaffolding of fibrin holding a lot of it together and helping it grow. So an enzyme that specifically targets and breaks down fibrin isn't doing something unrelated to the plaque. It's going after one of the actual building materials the plaque is made of. Now, I want to give the statin its due here because statins do what they're supposed to do. And it did win on one area of this study. It dropped LDL cholesterol, and it dropped total cholesterol and triglycerides, all better than did nattokinase. There's no argument there. It did exactly the job that it is designed to do. That's what statins do. But think about it. If lowering LDL and total cholesterol and triglycerides is the same thing as actually treating the disease in the artery wall, which is basically the founding assumption of cardiology over the last 40 years, then the group with the better cholesterol numbers should have walked away with less plaque. Instead, they walked away with 3 times more of it. And nattokinase raised protective HDL cholesterol too, something the statin did not touch at all. So perhaps the demon isn't cholesterol itself and LDL, but arterial plaque instead. And perhaps lowering LDL doesn't actually resolve that problem, which may be why heart disease isn't going away, even though that was the original promise of statin drugs. So why have you never heard of this? Now, here's what gets me fired up about this one a little bit. A trial like this, a head-to-head randomized imaging confirmed win over one of the most prescribed drug classes in human history. should have been a headline. It should have been all over CNN and Fox News and your local news and New York Times. And they should have continued running studies to prove that this study is actually what we think it is. But instead, it sat quietly in a Chinese language journal for almost a decade. And to my knowledge, it has never gotten a single mention on American television or in major U.S. medical journal roundups or from your mainstream cardiologist. This is a pattern I've watched my entire career. Research that threatens a very profitable, very entrenched paradigm doesn't usually get buried by through some smoke-filled room conspiracy. I mean, that happens too, but typically it just gets ignored. Nobody funds the follow-up study. Nobody translates it. Nobody puts it on a conference agenda, and it quietly disappears into the algorithm. That's not paranoia. That's just how incentives work. When an unpatentable soybean enzyme competes against a multi-billion-dollar drug class and wins. And here's a question I can't get out of my head. How is it that a communist country we're constantly told has inferior government-run healthcare systems somehow end up sitting on better head-to-head cardiovascular data than the country that calls itself the greatest healthcare system in the world? Yeah, right. Maybe it's because their researchers weren't the ones who needed permission from a drug company to publish the study. You've got to follow the money. Let's talk about the numbers for a second, because I think this is where people finally get why nobody's rushing to fund the definitive trial here. Because the global statin market is worth somewhere around 17 billion with a B dollars every single year, year after year. For the last 40 years, they've been making that money. That's not a one-time payday. That's a permanent revenue machine built on the assumption that lowering LDL is the same thing as preventing heart disease. It is not. If a study like this one ever got the attention it deserves, and the LDL equals plaque assumption started falling apart in the public eye, which it should, because I've done other shows on this that show that that hypothesis is just a hypothesis. It's never been proven. That's more than a minor inconvenience for the pharmaceutical industry. That's a multi-billion-dollar a year pillar getting kicked out from underneath it. It's also deeply inconvenient for your doctor, who is trained to trust that pillar completely, and for organizations like the American Heart Association, whose entire cholesterol-focused guiding framework depends on that pillar holding up. I mean, think about not just the loss of money, but the financial and reputational egg on the face of these people who've been preaching lower LDL, end heart disease for 40 years. They are holding on to this sacred cow as long as they possibly can. And studies like this are not going to enter the conversation through any mainstream means. So it has to come from little guys like the guy Xi, who found this and then shared it with me indirectly through his Substack, through my wife, and now I'm sharing it with you. And I think it's worth understanding why the agency that's supposed to be the referee here isn't exactly a neutral third party either. Right now, roughly 2/3 of the FDA's budget for reviewing new drugs comes directly from user fees paid by the drug companies whose products are being reviewed, not taxpayer dollars, not you and I, not an independent pot of money, fees paid directly by the industry being regulated. That arrangement isn't a secret. It's written into federal law and renegotiated with the industry every 5 years. But I don't think most people realize just how much of the agency meant to police these drugs is actually funded by the companies making the same drugs. So when you put it all together, a permanent multi-billion-dollar revenue stream, a regulatory body substantially funded by the industry it oversees, and the professional reputations built entirely on the cholesterol hypothesis, which I would actually now call the cholesterol myth, you start to understand why a study like this one we just walked through doesn't get anywhere near the attention that it should. So what is nattokinase actually doing, and does it make sense for you? The researchers in that 2017 trial went back and actually checked whether the plaque regression in the nattokinase group had anything to do with how much the cholesterol number had quote unquote improved. They say improved because it lowered, but is that really improving anything when cholesterol is critical for your heart, critical for your brain, and so many other things? But regardless, they went to see, did natto reduce cholesterol or LDL, or did it just work on plaque? And what they determined was the plaque reduction had nothing to do in these patients with their LDL number. The plaque went down in spite of the LDL number staying around where it was when they started. So it's not about lowering cholesterol. What is nattokinase actually doing in the artery? Well, nattokinase is not playing the same game as a statin. Statins work upstream, throttling how much cholesterol your liver produces in the first place, where nattokinase goes straight to the side of the problem. It's a fibrinolytic enzyme, meaning it works directly on fibrin, the structural protein we talked about, that scaffolding that holds the clot together. It goes after the actual enemy. There's research also going back to the early 2000s out of Japan showing nattokinase also disables something called PAI1, which is essentially the molecular brake that keeps your body from clearing clots in the first place. Take the brake off and your own natural clot dissolving system gets to do its job on the fibrin sitting in your plaque along with everything else. There's also older animal data suggesting it may be several times more potent than your body's own natural clot dissolving enzyme in that specific role. One is managing the supply line, your statin. The other is going after the actual scaffolding the plaque is built on. That's the difference. And that's why this isn't just a compelling mechanism on paper. It lines up directly with what the ultrasound actually showed. Now we have to talk about something really important, the dose. By and large, products on the market, including in my store, Vitality Nutrition, are between 1,000 fibrinolytic units and 2,000 fibrinolytic units per capsule. That's also known as FU, which nattokinase is, of course, a big FU to statins. But aside from that, 1,000 to 2,000. And here's the thing. The trial that we're talking about was not a 2,000 FU trial. It wasn't a 4,000, it was a 6,000. And this is what really grabbed my attention. So when Jen shared this article with me, I was really jazzed about the data. And I needed to know, okay, so what did they actually use? For how long did they use it? All this stuff. And I looked at it and it was 6,000 units. I had not seen, or didn't remember anyway, seeing a study at 6,000 units until I saw this one. There's very good evidence that 2,000 units is really good preventative maintenance for the cardiovascular system. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what they've determined in multiple studies, going all the way up to about 3,600 FU, is that plaque size doesn't shrink at that dose. So prevention of possibly additional plaque, yes, maybe. Prevention of higher blood pressure than normal, yes, it definitely. There's good research that. Prevention of overall clotting factor because of what it does with fibrin in the blood, yes. Potential benefit for inflammation, yes. All of those things at 2,000 FU per day. But at 6,000 FU per day, and this is why I love doing this show, because when people come in and they ask about nattokinase for all the things that they ask about, I have recommended 2,000 to 4,000 units a day. I've never recommended 6,000 units a day because I had not seen research that indicated that that was where we wanted to be. But there was another study that was done in 2022 that was done at 10,800 units per day. And it also had fantastic benefit. So it appears that, and I've been doing a fair amount of digging since I started this episode, which again is why I love doing this show, because I learned so much along with you, that higher doses of natto just yield better results. And maybe the 2,000 units that's kind of the standard just simply isn't enough for someone who has a higher heart health risk, family history, or we know that there's stuff going on with the carotid artery, or we have that higher calcium score that you may have looked at with your doctor, or any of those factors that make you think I'm at risk. And of course, most of us are at risk on some level. About a third of us die from this stuff, right? So 6,000 units, 3 capsules per day of a standard dose nattokinase is where we want to be, 3 per day. And it needs to be on an empty stomach, always on an empty stomach, always on an empty stomach, because nattokinase will break down other proteins as well. We want it on a stomach that doesn't have any protein in it so it can go directly to the blood and break down the fibrin. So when we line all this up from a potency standpoint, we find that dosage matters. The dosage curve matters. Most of the nattokinase is simply not enough at 1 capsule per day. Now, what I'm doing right now, as I just discovered this study a week ago. I wanted to bring it to you immediately because it is so compelling to me. And some of us need to get on this stuff right away, probably. But I'm looking for higher potency nattos, better options than what we have. But 3 capsules per day can be taken all at one time. That's how it was done in the study. At 2,000 units per capsule is great. And you can get that from reliable brands that I trust, that we carry here at Vitality, for like $1 a day, somewhere in that neighborhood, maybe just a little bit more depending on the brand. That's not too bad. And yes, it's 3 a day, but it's 3 capsules that can all be taken at one time. So it's pretty easy as long as you remember this. And this is the trick. It's got to be on an empty stomach at least an hour before you eat or 2 hours after you eat. So really first thing in the morning for most people, or maybe last thing at night. But what we know is that if you're doing preventative maintenance, 2,000 units per day is a good dose, maybe 4,000 units. If you're trying to actually move the number when it comes to your plaque, arterial plaque, we really need to be at least at that 6,000 unit dose. And it's important to understand. Now, sometimes I bring to you studies that show, a certain dosage did a certain thing. And then I will tell you, a great example of this is recently I talked about Akkermansia, the probiotic. There is a great groundbreaking study showing 10 billion units is the dose that works really, really well for blood sugar, for GLP-1 production. That's why we chose that amount to put in our GLP-1 metabolic optimizer formula. What there isn't is a study that shows that 5 billion units is not good or 7 billion units is not good. There's just a study that shows 10 billion units is amazing. So we go with 10 billion units because we know it works. But the difference here is that natto does have studies at lower doses, a lot of them that don't move the plaque number. So I believe that we need to shoot for that 6,000 unit dose because that's the dose that we know moves the plaque number. And you know why I like this study compared to a placebo-controlled study? Because it's a controlled study still, double blind, against an actual active material. So we're studying natto against a statin directly. And what I would have loved to have seen is a triple where we also studied a placebo to see what would happen with the placebo group. But what we know from this study that has been buried in China for almost a decade is that 6,000 units outperform statins by a mile, over 3-1 in what matters way more than a marker on your blood test result. And on top of this, natto is not a one-trick compound. The same enzyme has research behind it for lowering blood pressure in people already running a little high, for reducing blood viscosity so your blood simply moves easier through your vessels, for breaking down excess fibrin and inflammatory debris throughout the body, which is the same systemic enzyme category that I talked about with like Fibrinza, if you've heard my episodes of Fibrinza. Now, I personally take Fibrinza every single day. And soon I'm going to tell you an incredible story about that. I'm working on that episode as well because it blew my mind. I don't know if it'll blow your mind, but it's amazing. I was going to put it in this show and I decided to keep this one a little more concise, just focused on natto-K. But you're going to hear a lot about systemic enzymes in the next little bit because the more I use them myself, the more I research them like this, the more convinced I become. So I've been taking nattokinase consistently now for almost a year in Fibrinza, which is a complex. And Fibrinza is fantastic, and I'll encourage that if you want to do it. But economically speaking, if you're just looking at taking care of your cardiovascular system specifically, that's your big focus. Natto at that 6,000 units does so many things. It's so incredibly good. It has an incredible safety profile. The only caveat that I throw out there, and it is an important caveat, is that if you're already on a blood thinner, warfarin, Coumadin, Eliquis, those kind of things, I would recommend consulting with your pharmacist to talk about, whether or not Natto is a good option for you. The other thing I'll leave you with before we wrap up this show is that there is a lot of concern about clotting with long COVID and COVID vax injury. And it's a legitimate concern. There's plenty of evidence that this is a problem. Natto has been heavily recommended for that. I have not known what dose to recommend. I will now be recommending for people that are concerned about that, at least the 6,000 and maybe even higher. And you have my commitment that I'm looking for higher doses of really good quality products right now. We will link to the ones that we currently carry in this show description, but listen up for future recommendations, because as I find better ones, more potent ones from companies that are reputable. In fact, I'm very, very seriously considering coming out with one in the Vitality Nutrition brand. I will let you know. So that's all I've got for you today. Nattokinase outperforming a statin in a massive way. So cool, because once again, we score one for natural and not so much for pharmaceutical, and one more nail in the coffin of the cholesterol hypothesis. That's it for me. If you have questions, call us 801-292-6662. That's 801-292-6662. I have a question for you before you leave, if you're still listening. If you love what I bring to you on Vitality Radio, if you're a real fan of this show, I hope that you are, and if you're not, turn it off, go ahead, you can be done with me. But if you're a fan, will you leave a review on Apple Podcasts? Would you do that for me? Or even more useful than that, if you are a customer of ours and you love a product on our site, whatever it is, will you leave a review on there? We are a small, independent family company with a very small marketing budget. Almost exclusively what we do, marketing, is this podcast and a little bit of social media stuff, which we do not pay for. We do this in an effort to keep our prices down and just keep things as tight as we possibly can to give you the best bang for your buck. And that means grassroots support is really, really important to us. So I'm asking you, for me, my family, my business, if you're willing to just take a few minutes to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, to share this episode with someone who needs to hear it, or any of my episodes, check it out on YouTube and leave comments on YouTube and like and share. If you're willing to do any of those things for us, it would mean the world to me. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Jared St. Clair, and this has been Vitality Radio. Thanks for listening to the Vitality Radio podcast. If this episode helped you, follow the show, share it with someone, and explore trusted education and resources at vitalitynutrition.com. See you next time.
Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Vitality Radio. Just a reminder that this podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast has not been evaluated by the FDA. This podcast is provided with the understanding that the information shared is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. This podcast is not a substitute for professional care by a medical professional. Thank you.